Mike, can you tell us just a little bit about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, what it is, how it works, and maybe some major themes that you're seeing this year out of this new draft?
NIST is formalizing some best practices that I think have been floating around the industry for the last year, 2 years. So we've actually gone from the CFS 1.0 to 1.1, and now this is the 2.0 discussion draft of changes that have been basically out in the public for a while. They've had discussion groups and forums, and they kind of bring this feedback together into a draft. So what they've done is they've made a lot of language changes, which I think is good. They're trying to add sort of detail and remove vulgarity, remove sort of the gray area on some of the sectional findings that they have. I think the other couple of major pushes is defining sort of the assessment, so risk assessment itself specifically, strategy. So there's some specific requirements now under risk assessments, um, risk management entirely. That is, I think, a lot more detailed. Previously, it was set a risk tolerance and kind of talk through it. A lot of what they're talking about now is that not only do you have to have a risk strategy, but it has to be continuously updated. It has to be kind of documented whose people's roles and responsibilities are, which was part of the original framework, but they've just expanded on that to, I think, build out the program that really a true ERM, an enterprise risk management structure inside an organization, should really already be doing, but this formalizes some of those requirements. I was going to just mention the asset too. The piece that's interesting, I think, under the asset side is they got a lot more detailed under asset management as well. Um, they want to start talking about there's a view of managing data flows and managing where the data in an organization goes, and I think they've expanded asset management to include the data flows. One of the things that's kind of an add to the program entirely was sensitive data and corresponding metadata are inventoried and tracked. Now, that's a big ask. So there's a difference between knowing that your data is flowing one way or the other and tracking that the data has gone to a place. So I think there's some really interesting pushes towards having true control of the GLBA information, of the critical NPPI, NPI data that flows through an organization. So they've formalized some of that. That's not previously was in the framework really. So I think that's a really good addition to the program to allow us to start building processes and scoping technologies really that meet that need.
Thanks, Mike. And how do these changes and these recommendations, how will they affect cyber insurance for companies?
Yeah, so that's an interesting process as well. And so FFI, so the NIST publishes a guideline, and the insurance agencies that insure against cyber fraud or cyber threat, all institutions carry cyber policies through major insurers. So they may start adopting some of the NIST guidelines before the NCUA makes it an audit baseline. And it goes to a kind of a dichotomy in the world of finance that doing the baseline for the NCUA audit is not necessarily doing the due diligence that you need to for your cybersecurity program, especially based on your maturity, your size, where your program sits. Unless you are the smallest institution with a kind of lower level of maturity, you should really be looking to all those sources. So the NIST, the CIS controls, and ultimately the FFIC guidance, which may be behind some of those other somewhat faster moving organizations that are publishing these types of things.
And, Mike, I know this is a huge document and you probably will be hard to nail it down, but if you had to name one thing that you think is going to make a huge difference for credit unions, what would you say?
That's a tough one because they're making hundreds of changes. Some drop, some move, some rewords. Those are not as big of an issue. I think there's some things I could pull out. I really like that they have pushed a new category called continuous improvement. I think utilizing continuous improvement in your organization. So they put it under it's called improvement id.im, but the improvement piece of it is something that I really like to include in organizations as sort of a baseline structure, not just in security, but also in infrastructure and managing a technology environment. But it's basically you set your security framework out there, you set your policies, you set all your things. You really need to use this continuous evaluation to look at, review, assess, and tweak or change the security environment to ensure that you're staying secure. And I think that's a great concept that adds to the NIST framework in general. I think that's something that was sort of in there through some of the individual items that were asked, subcategories, but wasn't kind of explicitly talked about. And it kind of pulled this into its own category called improvement, which I really think is very valuable. But from the general document, I think there's a big takeaway here around documentation. Documenting data flows, documenting data inventory, where your data lives and who's touching it. Not necessarily documentation that's created internally, but monitoring documentation. And there seems to be a really big kind of peek under the covers here, where previously 10 years ago or so, the documentation needs for an audit were actually relatively minimal. There was quite a bit of documentation, but if you had to, you could pull it together at the last minute. It seems that as we go further down this road of maturity of cybersecurity, that documentation and standardization and policy tied together. So policy, procedures, and sort of the documentation to back all that up is becoming really critical. So I think that's a really big theme that I pulled out multiple times is these new items are also talking about documenting some of these new pieces, and that includes hardware, software, inventory of data, all of the pieces that are part of your risk program.